Hey everybody, welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're tackling a pretty complex topic, and a sensitive one too. We're going to be talking about gender pronouns and how those intersect with Christian beliefs.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic these days.
It is. So to help us sort through all this, we've got some excerpts from gender and pronouns in the Bible.
It's a really interesting source.
It is. It kind of goes through like the history and like how we got to where we are.
Yeah, it helps give some context, which is always helpful.
Always. So whether you are looking to just kind of understand the different perspectives on this issue, or maybe you're preparing for a conversation that you're going to have with someone about this, or maybe you're just curious to see how faith kind of navigates these waters,
Yeah.
this deep dive is definitely for you.
And the source really dives into some of those trickier aspects.
Yes, it does.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be talking about things like, the historical context of sex and gender,
Mm-hmm.
and then exploring the biblical perspective on transgenderism. And then we'll tackle some of those tricky pronoun situations.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this isn't just a modern debate. The source really traces these ideas way back. It helps us understand how thinking about sex and gender has evolved over time.
I love a good origin story. So let's start with the basics.
Okay, right.
We all learned about, the biology of sex in school.
Right.
XX chromosomes for females,
Mhm.
XY for males.
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward.
You'd think so, but the source points out that this binary understanding of biological sex was pretty much the norm in medicine and psychology up until like the mid-20th century.
Oh, wow. So it's really only recently that we started to see this distinction between sex, which is biological,
Right.
and then gender, which is more about like social roles and identity.
Exactly. And the source even mentions that there are now upwards of 70 different gender options being presented.
Wow, 70.
Yeah, it's a huge shift from where things were just a few decades ago.
That's a lot to wrap our heads around. But it sounds like what the source is saying is even with all of these different gender identities, biology,
Yeah.
those XX and XY chromosomes are still the foundation.
Yeah, that's the point they seem to be making. And it's a key foundation, especially when we start to look at this from a Christian perspective.
Okay, so let's bring faith into the picture. The source spends quite a bit of time unpacking how sin impacts humanity. And they cite verses like all over the place, Genesis, Psalms, Romans.
Yeah, and what I found interesting is how the source connects that to the concept of gender dysphoria.
Okay.
It argues that if sin can cause things like physical birth defects, then it's possible that gender dysphoria could also be a consequence of living in a fallen world.
So for those who don't know gender dysphoria, that's that feeling of distress because your gender identity doesn't match your biological sex.
Right.
Okay, so that's a pretty heavy concept.
Yeah.
They even compare it to things like anger and lust,
Yeah.
which traditionally considered sins,
Mm-hmm.
even if they might have some biological or genetic component to them.
Right. They're saying that even if there are biological factors at play, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not sinful to embrace those feelings or to act on them.
It definitely adds another layer of complexity to this already complex issue,
It does. And it leads right into another thorny issue for Christians:
which is,
preferred pronouns.
yes, the pronoun dilemma.
So you've got individuals who identify as transgender, and they're requesting to be addressed by pronouns that align with their gender identity and not their biological sex.
Right, so the source gives the example of like a biological male who identifies as female asking to be called she and her.
Exactly, and it doesn't stop there. The source also mentions the use of they-them pronouns, and even newer ones like sex and mixer.
It's hard to keep up.
It really is.
But the big question that the source asks is, does using these preferred pronouns conflict with Christian beliefs?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, the Bible doesn't give us like a simple black and white answer. The source acknowledges that there's no verse that explicitly says you must or you must not use preferred pronouns.
So then how are Christians supposed to approach this? Like what guidance does the source offer?
Well, it presents two main perspectives that I think we can kind of unpack here.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's hear them.
Okay, so the first perspective is that using preferred pronouns is basically endorsing a falsehood. The source uses Isaiah 5:2,
Okay.
which is a verse about calling evil good and good evil to support this. It suggests that using pronouns that don't align with biological sex could be seen as a similar distortion of God's design.
So that side sees it as like going against biblical truth.
Exactly.
What about the other perspective?
So the second perspective really emphasizes the potential harm that could come from refusing to use someone's preferred pronouns. They focus on relationships and minimizing hurt or conflict, especially in personal or professional settings.
So it's kind of like this balancing act of, on the one hand, you want to adhere to your beliefs, and on the other hand, you want to be sensitive to the feelings of others.
Yeah, it's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And the source actually says, be wise as serpents and harmless as doves.
That's a great line. It's from Matthew 10.16.
Yeah.
And it's all about finding that delicate balance in each situation.
I can see how this would create a lot of tension for Christians trying to navigate this.
Yeah, definitely.
Is there any further guidance that's offered in the source?
Actually, there are several key considerations for Christians as they're wrestling with this.
Okay, I definitely want to unpack those. So let's move on to part 2. Okay, so we left off talking about those 2 main perspectives that the source presents on using preferred pronouns. This stuff gets deep quickly, but I'm really curious to see what other guidance is offered.
Yeah, so the source dives into some specific considerations for Christians who are kind of grappling with this topic. And first up is this concept of respecting all persons.
Okay.
It emphasizes that even when disagreements exist, Christians are called to treat everyone with respect. They actually pull in a verse from 1 Peter 3.15 to back that up.
That's the verse about always being ready to give an answer for the hope you have, but doing it with gentleness and respect. So I guess that means, like, even if you don't agree with someone's choices or lifestyle, you can still treat them with dignity and kindness.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their beliefs or choices.
Yeah.
And the source also highlights the importance of considering your relationships when you're navigating this issue.
Okay.
It suggests that how you approach the topic might look different depending on who you're talking to. So, for instance, a conversation with a close friend who is struggling with gender identity might be different from, like, debating this on social media with a stranger.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Context and relationships definitely matter in these situations. But doesn't that get tricky when you're also trying to stay true to your beliefs?
That's a key tension, right? The source is very clear that Christians shouldn't shy away from what they believe, even when it's unpopular or controversial.
Yeah.
In fact, it cites John 14.6 and 1 John 4.1. Those verses about Jesus being the only way to salvation and the importance of testing the spirits as support for that stance.
So it's like this push and pull. On the one hand, you want to be loving and accepting, and on the other hand, you feel like you can't compromise on your beliefs. How do you find that balance?
Right. And that's why the source emphasizes this need to balance truth and love.
Oh,
It reminds us that we're called to speak the truth, but to do it with love. Citing Ephesians 4.15, which talks about speaking the truth in love, and Romans 12.19, which is all about living at peace with everyone as much as possible.
so it sounds like there's a lot of nuance here. It's not as simple as just saying yes or no to preferred pronouns across the board.
You're right. This is a multifaceted issue, and it forces us to really grapple with our beliefs and how we live them out in a complex world.
And just when you think you've got your head wrapped around it, the source brings up this distinction between pronouns and names.
Yeah.
It argues that using a preferred name isn't the same as using a preferred pronoun, even if that name is unusual or chosen to reflect a gender identity.
Yeah, I found that distinction fascinating, too. The source argues that names identify individuals while pronouns imply something about their nature or essence.
I see what they mean. Calling someone by their chosen name is an act of acknowledging their identity, but using a specific pronoun might feel like you're making a statement about their biology or gender.
It's a subtle but significant difference, and it raises all sorts of interesting questions about the power of language.
Speaking of interesting questions, the source also touches on some secular concerns about compelled pronoun use, which I wasn't expecting from a text focusing on the Bible.
Yeah, it's interesting that they bring that in, right? But it's a compelling argument. It suggests that forcing people to use preferred pronouns could be seen as violating free speech.
Right.
After all, you can't force someone to say something they don't believe. They use this analogy about demanding people call you your majesty, even if they don't believe you're royalty.
It's kind of a funny example, but it drives home the point. So you've got these secular concerns about free speech, and then you've got these religious concerns about endorsing falsehood or causing harm. It's a lot to consider.
It is.
Is there anything else we need to unpack from this section of the source?
Well, there's one more point that I thought was really interesting. The source brings up the fact that the Bible uses masculine pronouns for God, even though God doesn't have a biological sex.
Oh, that's a good point. That seems to contradict the whole argument against preferred pronouns.
Right. But the source actually addresses that apparent inconsistency. They say that God isn't claiming to actually be male by using those pronouns.
Yeah.
It's not the same as using pronouns for a person that don't align with their biological sex, because it's not making a statement about God's physical body in the same way.
I never thought about it that way. It definitely highlights the complexities of language and interpretation.
It does. It shows that this whole issue is far from simple.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about respect relationships, truth, love, and the nuances of language and interpretation. But with all these complexities, what's the takeaway for Christians who are trying to make sense of this?
That's a great question, and it's one the source tackles head-on in the next section.
Okay, well, let's dive into that when we return. All right, we are back. And, it's one thing to learn about all this stuff in theory, but it really hits differently when you start thinking about how it plays out in, real-life situations.
It does, and the source really emphasizes that. It reminds us that we're discussing all this in the context of a fallen world, which just adds another layer of complexity to the issue.
Right. The source even cites Romans 5.12 and Romans 1.2122.
Yeah.
Those verses about sin entering the world and humanity kind of distorting God's design. So how does that tie into this conversation?
Well, the source uses those verses to argue that because of the fall, we need to be extra careful and seek wisdom in how we balance love, truth, and obedience. It emphasizes the need for discernment and humility as we navigate these complex questions. Even bringing up some verses like Acts 5.29, Hebrews 10.23, and 1 Thessalonians 5.21.
Those are powerful verses reminding us to prioritize God's commands over human authority, stand firm in our faith, and carefully examine everything and hold on to what is good. But how does that practically apply to this conversation about gender and pronouns?
Well, it encourages us to approach these issues with a deep sense of responsibility, recognizing that our words and actions have real consequences. And it leads us to the final topic, the source tackles, which is gender-affirming care.
Okay, I've heard that term, but to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what it entails.
Yeah.
Can you kind of shed some light on that for me and for our listeners?
Sure. So the source defines gender-affirming care as a range of treatments and interventions that are intended to align a person's physical characteristics with their gender identity. This can include everything from therapy and social transitioning, like changing one's name and pronouns, to more medical interventions like hormone therapy and surgery.
So it's about helping people transition both socially and physically to kind of match how they feel inside.
Right. And the source actually presents a pretty strong argument against this from a theological standpoint, particularly when it comes to the medical interventions.
Okay, that's interesting.
hmm
What's the basis for their argument?
Well, they state that affirming a person's subjective gender identity contradicts the biblical view of gender as fixed at birth. They point to verses like Genesis 1.27 and Deuteronomy 22.5, and they also raise concerns about the potential harm these treatments can cause, both physically and emotionally.
So it's not just a theological objection, it's also concern for the well-being of those who are seeking these treatments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They even cite a study that was published by the Heritage Foundation that found an increase in suicidal ideation after body-altering surgery. They give the URL if anyone wants to explore that research further. It's www.heritage.org. Gender commentary sex reassignment doesn't work, here the evidence.
Wow, that's a sobering reminder that this is a deeply sensitive and complex issue with potentially life-altering consequences.
It is.
So with all these different perspectives and potential risks,
Yeah.
what does the source suggest as a way forward for Christians?
Well, it points to the example of Jesus interacting with the adulterous woman in John 8.111.
Oh yeah, it's a powerful story.
It is. It's where the Pharisees are about to stone her, and Jesus steps in and says, "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone."
I love that story. What does the source draw from that?
They use that story as a model for combining grace and truth. Just as Jesus showed compassion to the woman while still acknowledging her sin, Christians should extend love and support to those struggling with gender dysphoria, while also holding firm to the belief that gender is part of God's design and shouldn't be altered.
That's a beautiful picture of balancing conviction with compassion. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners walk away with?
Well, I think it's crucial to recognize that gender identity is a multifaceted topic with theological, social, and deeply personal implications. There are a variety of viewpoints within Christianity on how to approach this, and it's okay to wrestle with these questions. There's no shame in not having all the answers.
I appreciate that. It's not about finding the right answer. It's
Oh.
about engaging in thoughtful and respectful dialogue, seeking to understand different perspectives and wrestling with these questions in a way that honors both our faith and our relationship.
Exactly. And as we navigate these conversations, it's important to approach them with wisdom, grace, and a steadfast commitment to truth.
Well said. This has been a truly enlightening deep dive, and I hope it's equipped our listeners to engage in these conversations with more understanding and empathy.
Me too. It's been a pleasure exploring this with you.
Before we go, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. How might your understanding of God's love and grace inform your interactions with those who identify as transgender, even if you disagree with them on theological grounds? It's a question worth reflecting on as we seek to live out our faith in a world that's increasingly complex and diverse. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another thought-provoking exploration.